Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We're excited to welcome you to this webinar hosted in partnership between OneMed and Greenlight Guru, two organizations that have shared a strong working relationship for several years and grounded in a mutual commitment to helping MedTech manufacturers succeed in an increasingly complex regulatory and clinical environment.
We've seen firsthand how clinical missteps or misaligned strategies can result in lost time, increased cost, and missed opportunities for patient access. That's why we actually felt it was important to come together, share not only our insights and perspectives, but also some of the real-world experiences we've gained in supporting MedTech innovators across the globe.
So our goal today is simple: to provide you with practical guidance, actionable strategies that you can take back to your teams, whether you're evaluating a single region study or planning for global market access. We're glad you're here. We look forward to a thoughtful, productive session. So just some brief introductions to start with. I'm John Thomas, Director of Strategic Delivery here at OneMed. I've spent over 20 years in the clinical research industry, starting out my career in respiratory physiology, then moving into phase 1 clinical research, and then moving into leadership roles in the MedTech CRO world, where I've had the opportunity to oversee global trials across a wide range of therapeutic areas, from cardiovascular implants to dermal fillers, from early feasibility studies and large complex pivotal clinical trials and post-market programs. I specialize in helping MedTech innovators navigate the operational complexities of running clinical trials in both Europe and the US. My focus is on building smart, efficient strategies that not only meet regulatory expectations, but also support your long-term commercial success. If you'd like to connect with me directly, you can reach me at johnthomas@onemed.ch, or simply scan the QR code at the end of today's presentation, where I'd be happy to continue the conversation. I'm joined today by a friend and industry peer from Greenlight Guru, Carl Taylor.
Hi everybody, I'm Carl Taylor, Business Development Director for EMEA at Greenlight Guru. I have been in the life sciences industry for almost 30 years, and 20 years of those have been in commercial positions, particularly focused around software solutions to support both pharma and particularly MedTech get their devices and products to market faster. I've covered the whole development process from design through to quality control, right up to clinical trials. And so my passion is really supporting you with solutions that can help you get your devices into patients faster. Like John, you can contact me afterwards if you want to reach out to me on carl.taylor@greenlight.guru, or you can scan the QR code at the end. So a little bit of housekeeping just before we dive into the presentation. First, we want to invite you to actively participate. So please use the chat on the right to connect with your fellow attendees, and use the Q&A tab to ask questions for our Q&A session later on. We really welcome those. And secondly, we're going to be sending out a full recording and the presentation slides to all registrants after the live event. So if you can watch your inbox for that follow-up email. Just a quick word on Greenlight Guru. So our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medical device industry, which I guess is a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and really to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medical device companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. And our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management. And we'll really delve into areas around that a little bit later. Everything we do is tailored specifically for the medical device industry. And you can join, over 1,000 leading medical device companies that trust us by visiting our website, www.greenlight.guru. And afterwards, you can use the links on there to reach out for a personalized demo or for further information for anything that's interesting that you see.
And OneMed is a Swiss-based ISO 13485 certified global partner offering full-service CRO and regulatory support for medical device, pharmaceutical, and combination product development. With expertise spanning preclinical, clinical, regulatory, and post-market stages, at OneMed, we deliver scalable, customized solutions from first-in-human studies to post-market real-world evidence programs, helping manufacturers and sponsors navigate the complex European and US frameworks. With over 170 international clinical studies and over 14 notified body partnerships in the European Union, we aim to streamline your product approvals and commercial success through innovation, quality, and strategic collaboration. Please head to our website, www.onemed.ch, and explore our wide range of expertise and service offering. So just a disclaimer before we go into today's topical discussion. This presentation is provided for informational purposes only and reflects the views and interpretations of the presenters based on the current knowledge and guidance at the time of its delivery. It does not constitute legal, regulatory, or clinical advice, nor should it be relied upon as such. All participants are encouraged to consult with appropriate experts and regulatory authorities for specific guidance related to their own products, regions, and development plans. OneMed and Greenlight Guru disclaim any liability for decisions made or actions taken based on the content of this webinar. By attending this session, you acknowledge your acceptance and the terms of this disclaimer. So how to make the correct clinical trade-offs between the FDA and the MDR, and why this conversation matters now. With the European Union medical device regulation now fully in effect and the FDA advancing new expectations for clinical evidence and real-world data, MedTech companies are under growing pressure to make strategic trade-offs that can affect your time to market, your cost, and long-term compliance. The conversation really matters now because the regulatory landscape is continuing to shift and the cost of misalignment is high. Companies are increasingly finding that decisions made to satisfy one regulatory body can delay or derail your approval in another. So the challenge is no longer just about meeting requirements. It's more about optimizing your clinical program to support both regulatory success and commercial viability. So if you're considering a US-only strategy, remember that the FDA currently provides clear guidelines and review pathways. Their Q-Sub process allows for early feedback on clinical strategy and protocol design. The US offers support for innovation. The FDA is often more collaborative during the early feasibility and PMA planning process, and the FDA is often willing to accept novel trial designs and adaptive designs. US clinical data is often highly valued globally, and so can be useful to support market access in countries like regions like Canada, Japan, Latin America. There are some challenges, however, and emerging risks that we simply cannot ignore coming from the US. Recently publicized by the FDA, the layoffs and the workforce reductions potentially delaying IDE approvals, slowing down your PMA review timelines. IDE trials are very costly and complex, often requiring IRB approvals, monitoring GCP compliance across multiple US sites. Contract negotiations, IRB approvals, and hospital onboarding timelines can sometimes take more than 3 to 6 months per site. And the FDA may require a larger sample size and a longer follow-up timeline than was typical in the European post-market clinical follow-up programs. So now let's look at why European clinical investigations may be more favorable. If you have a legacy device, the European Union allows for CE mark extensions based on clinical data from well-designed PMCF studies. So if your device is already CE marked under the MDD, initiating a European trial can support compliance extension and real-world validation under the MDR. So leveraging real-world data coming from different sources, like surveys, observational registries, could be a successful way of generating your clinical data as evidence. You may be considering proceeding with the European trial as a mitigation step against the potential delays we're now seeing and coming from the FDA review. So European notified bodies, while they're also backlogged, are now showing more consistency and maturity in processes under the MDR. So in this context, leveraging a CRO that is experienced in working with the different EU notified bodies can prove to be very beneficial for manufacturers. In Europe, Class 2A, Class 2B devices often benefit from more streamlined approvals and fewer requirements from large randomized trials. Depending on the device risk, you could initiate smaller pragmatic investigations with less formal IDE-like barriers, Sometimes an MDR-compliant PMCF design can suffice for surveillance needs, especially for the lower-risk medical devices. When it comes to site activation, speed and cost, EU countries like Spain, Poland, and Italy often offer faster startup timelines, sometimes only 3 to 4 months from the submission. Europe often offers lower investigator grants and operational costs, which makes Europe a more cost-effective option. Target patient populations are often more accessible in Europe. Certain indications may have stronger investigator networks or higher patient concentrations in the EU than in the US. Indications for oncology, ophthalmology, cardiology, and rare disease trials often benefit from centralized care pathways that comes from European hospitals. Maybe you're looking to build a global evidence by using regional leverage. So in this instance, a trial started in Europe could be designed to meet both MDR and FDA requirements. And the EU could serve as a first mover region, especially when US trial setup may delay your go-to-market timelines. However, the US may still remain favorable if it is your primary commercial target. And in this case, remember the FDA clearance, 510K pathway, de novo PMA is required to enter the US market. And clinical data from US sites carries high credibility for the US payers, for providers, and the IDE and the PMA pathways are designed with reimbursement and market entry in mind. So trials focused on health economics, usability, or workflow efficiencies are more relevant when run in US clinical environments. The US can offer faster access to early feasibility programs, particularly for novel high-risk devices, and the FDA's early feasibility guidance is well established and accessible for startups. But consider, Class 3 devices needing a pre-market approval must rely heavily on US-based pivotal clinical studies, which are often costly. The FDA expects these trials to demonstrate safety and effectiveness across diverse US populations, and the CE marking alone from the EU won't satisfy your PMA standards. However, it can often be easier to start in Europe to obtain market access and then go into the US after obtaining the CE mark. So now time for a quick poll, and I'd like and encourage everybody to participate in the poll. The polling question that we'd like you to bring your answers to is, when planning your clinical evidence strategy, which of the following best reflects your current position? There are 4 options to answer. Option number 1 would be, we are confident in choosing the US as our primary region for data collection. Option number 2 would be, we're confident in choosing the EU as our primary region for data collection. Option number 3, we're unsure which region is more suitable. And option number 4, we're currently delaying our clinical plans due to regulatory uncertainty. So I'll give everybody a moment to take time to select your answers. Okay, I think we're good to proceed. Thank you very much for participating. So now let's look at what a hybrid clinical strategy may look like. So in short, a hybrid clinical investigation strategy potentially allows manufacturers to leverage the strengths of both European and US regulatory pathways, with the aim of balancing speed, cost, and the long-term global market access. A hybrid strategy involves initiating or running clinical trials across both Europe and the US, either sequentially, simultaneously, or as a functional split. Here are some common hybrid models to consider. If you have a legacy device, CE marked under the MDD, you could proceed in Europe for your post-market clinical follow-up and use the data to support or de-risk your US IDE submission. The example would be starting up a real-world observational study in Spain and Poland, then using the data to shape the US IDE protocol submission. Or you may want to consider a parallel execution strategy, whereby you would submit to the FDA and European notified bodies in parallel. And in this model, you leverage a multi-region trial design using a harmonized protocol aligned with both the MDR and the FDA requirements. Can be a useful model if your budget permits, and it can be a good option for high-risk devices, which could yield faster global go-to-market timelines. So the example of this would be one global pivotal trial with dual endpoints satisfying both the MDR and the FDA demands. When your device is already CE marked and there is a desire for US expansion, you may want to consider using Europe for surveillance and the US for the approval. So running a pivotal IDE trial in the US to obtain the required FDA clearance, while simultaneously running a low intervention PMCF study design in Europe to maintain the CE mark obligations under the MDR. Or additionally, you may consider running a pilot study in Europe and then scale up in the US, conducting a pilot or feasibility study in Europe to leverage lower entry barriers and use the data to refine your design or endpoints before entering a US pivotal trial submission, a strategy that could minimize IDE rejections or risk of a redesign. So in summary, manufacturers aiming to market in Europe must still generate clinical data that meets the EU MDR expectations, including PMCF. Pulling your trials from Europe as a shift for US preference could potentially delay European market access or raise notified body scrutiny later down the line. Diversifying your geographies in European and US strategy reduces regulatory risk concentration and builds broader real-world data across populations, a major asset for global market entry. And despite the perception of regulatory complexity in Europe, many European centers offer high-quality data, experienced investigators, and strong patient recruitment networks, particularly for therapeutic areas like oncology and rare disease. So rather than shifting entirely from Europe to the US, medical device manufacturers should always evaluate trial location as a portfolio level decision, not be reactive to industry trends. Consider parallel planning for US and European submissions when global market access is needed. And always consider leveraging a local CRO partnership with expertise in navigating the EU MDR.
They're actually really helpful, John. And actually interesting to see that, you can collect data in Europe, but then that can be utilized for a US submission and vice versa, or towards part of it. So, using those regional studies is interesting. When we talk about data, obviously that isn't regional at all. We can work across any geography. And what I'd like to do as we kind of delve into this a little bit is let everybody cast their mind back to around about 4 or 5 years ago. I'm sure we all remember it, apart from the empty roads and everything else that some of us enjoyed. That's a time when we had global lockdowns, restrictions, particularly in healthcare settings across the globe. But I was actually surprised, and I'm sure you will be, to learn that according to the World Health Organization, over 250,000 clinical trials were actually registered worldwide in 2020 alone. That's actually despite all the pandemic conditions. And many of those trials actually went forward. What's a bigger surprise to me personally is that round about 20% of those were medical device trials. So, that's an awful lot of trials that took place in a time when we had all of these restrictions. And the data is one of the things that helped us do that, and the way that we captured data. So the changes that occurred really during that time accelerated the use of software tools in clinical trials. Remote monitoring and decentralized trials surged. I don't think anybody talked about decentralized trials, or very few did, before 2020. Accurate real-time data capture became an absolute essential aspect of every clinical trial. But the key takeaway for me here is that if we could run trials and we had the right tools at that time to continue them through a pandemic, then our approach to data capture must already be robust enough to keep up with the current changes. We're already partway there. We just need to ensure that we put them in action. But the thing about clinical data is there's no point in just collecting trials data in a poor, unstructured way. So I'm sure everybody's heard that saying, garbage in equals garbage out, and it's never actually been true when it comes to clinical data. Data capture on what you collect affects tons and tons of things. So things like device safety validation, clinical performance substantiation, of course, your regulatory filing. Doesn't matter whether that's in the EU or the US, right? The data that you capture has a massive effect on that. But using real-time structured data actually supports a faster submission cycle, stronger clinical evaluation reports, and also improved market surveillance readiness. So just remember that poor data capture leads to incomplete evidence, and then ultimately that also leads to delayed approvals, or even worse, recalls. So if we think about the key components of high quality data that you need to consider as a medtech organization, these are things like ECRFs that are specifically tailored for devices, the inclusion of things like integrated adverse event reporting, workflow automation for monitoring and data integrity, and real-world data feeds. And we see this much more, and particularly after the pandemic, but now we're asked this on an almost weekly basis about the inclusion of more integrated solutions. I'm talking about wearables and activity trackers and real-time cardiovascular monitoring, and then apps that are giving feeds into clinical systems and remote sensors. Patient-reported outcomes on phones, tablets, computers are actually easier to implement than ever, and definitely more common. They're super important in the case of many medical devices because of the nature of how we work with them. But I think particularly for me, they're also important when it comes to devices that are programmed to meet individual patient treatment requirements. So you may be having a patient-reported outcome that influences how the next program is delivered to that device that helps them moving forward. Of course, you know, one of the things that we do have to remember is to stay site-centric. So, you know, the data collection we must make easy for the sites. They're running studies for multiple different sponsors, utilizing a whole host of different data solutions. So really working with data capture systems that are purpose-built for medtech actually reduces site burden and reduces trial burden and increases study efficacy. So for me, you know, strong data capture actually equals strong evidence, and then in turn equals strong regulatory confidence. You know, John touched on some of this a little bit earlier, but sponsors can actually make things easier for themselves by taking into account how evidence plans could be aligned with both the FDA and the EU. So how can you get the most out of what you're doing, not only in the trial design, but in the data capture as well. So if you invest in the right strategy and support systems early, it actually helps to avoid things like gaps in evidence, which can cost a fortune. You know, you can prove safety and performance faster. And you can also build trust, not only with the regulators, but also clinicians and patients. And when I think about it in terms of clinicians, you think of the key opinion leaders who can perhaps influence other trials or other people within other regions to take on your trials in future. And patients who are on one of your trials at an earlier stage are more likely to register at the later stage trials or the post-market trials because it might be easy to work with you. So I think, you know, by thinking ahead, thinking about future geographies as you plan out your trials, it can actually make sure that the data tells a full story, and it just simplifies things for you down the line. So if I think about how streamlining data collection works, not only does it reduce manual entry and protocol deviations, it actually improves protocol adherence, which again, ultimately reduces costly rework. And we still hear of particularly early stage medtech companies trying to do workarounds, still capturing things like EDC or CRFs on paper, giving patient-reported outcomes on paper, using things like Excel. But a 2022 Tufts study actually found that using e-clinical tools can reduce trial timelines by up to 30%. So, you know, that automation not only enables faster query resolution and real-time insights for decision making, but it also leads to a faster database lock, therefore a quicker submission, And in the end, that's going to give you earlier market access, which is what we all want, right? And therefore, you know, ultimately, it's going to be a quicker return on investment for you as a company, and also for anybody who's actually invested in you to help you get to that stage. So then, you know, if I look at MedTech specific tools and how they can give you a little bit of a competitive edge getting to market, according to MedTech Europe, they did a survey in 2023 that said that device trials that are using purpose-built platforms actually report a 20 to 40% lower monitoring costs. And to me, this is not actually surprising. If we think about the platforms that are traditionally used for clinical data capture, many of them have actually been repurposed from pharma. And although many are fantastic platforms, they also have a lot of back-end integration into tools that we may never use in MedTech, and also added complexity or even things that are more pharma specific. So it really doesn't meet our needs 100%. For us in MedTech, we're actually more interested in looking at device usability over things like biomarkers. Obviously, our trials tend to be much shorter initially, and then longer term, we're focused on real world post-market evidence. So if you're working with purpose-built MedTech tools, you can have things like device performance specific CRFs, integrated UDI tracking, and automated PMCF planning and reporting that helps you down the line. And of course, you know, improved data quality supports better outcomes, therefore faster approvals, and therefore easier integration into that PMCF process. Now, I'm sure everybody's wondering when we were going to get to this part, because no conversation about data at the moment can move forward without mentioning AI. We've seen a huge explosion over the past 12 months, and we only expect it to get bigger. But I think there's things that we need to consider as being MedTech companies within this space and the data that we actually get. So, you know, your source data actually needs to be in a good state. And if you think about that in terms of the chatbots that we're now all using on a daily basis, 12 months ago, the prompts that we gave them to get a particular answer are very different than the prompts that we give now to get the same eventual answer. And so in the context of clinical data, if you've got uncategorized, disparate data, that's going to be very difficult to use years down the line in AI and machine learning settings. If data's all over the place and not catalogued correctly, it's actually going to make it more difficult. That's not to say you can't do it, but make things easier for yourself. Have the prompts there by having the data catalogued correctly to start with. Additionally, we all know that clinical trials are very expensive to run. So surely you actually want to make the most out of any evidence that you capture. So remember, you can use good data to help in future device designs, study designs, or even patient recruitment, or even finding, you know, the best sites, etc. All of that can come from the clinical data that you've got. So for me, considering how you catalog your data now and how you capture it and how you store it can help you in 15 to 20 years down the line. And that's something that everybody really needs to consider, is thinking early doors, what's the process? How are we going to run this trial? What's the strategy? And how can we use that data in 5, 10, or 15 years' time?
Thank you, Carl. It's good to see how digital platforms like Greenlight Guru are keeping pace with the changing regulatory and clinical landscape. So now that we've discussed the regulatory landscape and clinical strategy implications of those, it's important now to think of the operational reality. Because generating high quality clinical data isn't just about trial design. It's also about execution and how trials are run. Everything from import logistics, labeling, site onboarding, to patient recruitment and monitoring. So let's now explore how these operational touchpoints in both Europe and the US can either support or complicate your ability to collect clean, compliant and meaningful clinical evidence. So with labeling and language requirements in mind, in Europe, labels must always comply with the EU MDR Annex 1, Section 23, and local language rules, and country-specific translations are needed for your instructions for use. In the US, labeling must include a caution notice, must not bear any misleading branding, and English only is accepted for US clinical sites. And for the IDE, labels must always follow the IDE specific guidance from the FDA. When it comes to clinical data monitoring and oversight, in Europe, risk-based monitoring is widely accepted and aligned with the EMA guidance. Remote monitoring is increasingly common, especially since the post-COVID European trials. And GCP compliance is reviewed by national authorities, not centrally governed as the FDA. And in the US, the FDA expects robust on-site monitoring, unless a robust justification is given for risk-based monitoring strategy. Monitoring must comply with 21 CFR Part 812 for IDE and Part 5056 for ethical standards. And FDA audits focus heavily on source data verification and protocol compliance. Unless it's well justified, some FDA reviewers have been less accepting of full remote data review in pivotal trials. So bear that in mind. For site network structures in Europe, many countries have centralized ethics approvals, Belgium, Netherlands, Spain as examples. Sites are often part of national hospital networks or a public healthcare system. You could expect faster site engagement in countries like Hungary, Spain, and Italy. This can lead to shorter startup timelines and a more standardized site onboarding process. Whereas the US operate under a decentralized model, each site operates independently. Large academic centers are often prestigious, but sometimes slower to activate. Startup timelines vary significantly due to independent contracting, IRB approvals, and budgeting cycles. CROs often need to navigate site-specific SOPs and payment structures and staff turnovers. When it comes to patient availability, Europe leverages a universal healthcare system, making access more equitable. Patients are often treated in centralized tertiary care hospitals. Europe offers a stronger integration from physician referrals and registries, and for certain chronic or surgical conditions, European patients are often easier to identify and pre-screen. However, in the US, can often be strong in some specialist-driven indications, but private insurance variability can sometimes be a barrier when it comes to coverage for study-related costs, and recruitment often relies on site outreach or digital patient advocacy groups. With regard to site performance, European sites offer lower investigator grant costs and more predictable budgets. European sites often offer strong long-term investigator relationships through CRO and sponsor networks, and in some regions, you could expect higher enrollment rates, particularly Spain, Czech Republic. In the US, high-performing sites are sometimes expensive due to PI fees, overheads, and budgets. Performance often hinges on dedicated research coordinators, and recruitment is often impacted by competing trials at the major urban centers. So as a closing summary, today's discussion shows that navigating the clinical and regulatory landscapes of both Europe and the US markets require more than just technical compliance. It requires strategic foresight, operational agility, and the ability to make smart trade-offs. The complexity of dual region requirements, shifting FDA timelines, and evolving MDR expectations mean that manufacturers should think of partnering with organizations that can translate challenges into actionable, scalable solutions. So now time for some Q&A. We would appreciate taking receipt of some of your questions. So let's just take a moment to receive those.
Yeah, we've already had some coming in as well, John, as we've been doing this. So let me have a quick look. There's okay, the one that I think's one for you to answer. How can small medtech companies manage the cost and complexity of dual region trials?
How can small medtech companies manage costs? So it's a good question, realistic to today's environment and marketplace. I mean, it depends on the risk class, but maybe consider, as maybe I spoke to in the slides, starting with a small pilot study in Europe, then scale up into the US. leverage the lower costs coming from Europe, and then use your data to refine your US pivotal trial design for market access into the US. In that instance, always consider leveraging the expertise and the support that comes from CROs like OneMed that bring subject matter experts to the table to help you streamline your activities and avoid any duplication of activities through the dual region process.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Cheers, John. Thank you. I'll pick this one up. So, how early should data strategy be aligned with clinical and regulatory planning? Short answer is as quickly as possible. Immediately from the beginning. But ideally, you should develop your data strategy in parallel with your clinical trial design and your regulatory planning. So early alignment really helps ensure that any data that you're actually collecting supports the relevant regulatory submissions. As you're talking to the regulators, you're going to understand what study endpoints they're going to require from you. And then, you're also going to be able to ensure that data fields that you're collecting meets payer and market access needs. The other point is that what you want to avoid is duplication or gaps later in the development process. So, the earlier that you plan, the more complete you can make the data and ensure that you're not having to do things, ad hoc or later on, and then have surprises basically. And it's just going to help you get more scalable and more efficient trials with fewer surprises. I mean, have you got anything to add to that, John, from your perspective as well?
Well, I mean, it's always a question that I get asked as well, right? How early should we think about clinical strategy? And again, the answer is, I'm going to say straightforward, but it really is as early as possible. So even during the design and development phase, think about your end goal, commercialization, right? And, because that then sets the scene for your clinical pathway, which then defines your endpoints and your risk. So, the earlier you can define that and understand that, the better. But it really depends on, your end game, which is your commercialization in mind.
Okay, yeah, that's good. The other one that's kind of a follow-on to this is how can poor data quality impact regulatory approvals? And I think this all goes hand in hand, right? If you've got missing data or inconsistent data or unstructured data, obviously that can lead to massive delays and obviously jeopardize regulatory approval. So the notified bodies, the FDA, etc., they all expect you to have complete and verifiable data sets. So if you've got incomplete or unreliable data, then that's going to increase audit risk. It's also going to lead to rejection. And of course, John mentioned earlier about the recent changes in the FDA, etc. The last thing that we want is our projects to be held back or to be rejected or have to do additional data requests. The worst case scenario, if we've got poor data and we're not collecting the right amounts or we're missing data points, is that we might have to repeat a trial. And of course, that's a situation that absolutely nobody wants to get into. Yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, John, at all.
No, I think you covered that one, Carl.
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. And then another one was, and again, I get this asked literally on a weekly basis, what regulatory considerations apply when collecting data from connected or wearable devices? And there's kind of a misconception that because we can collect data from a Garmin or whatever else, then we can use it. And that's not actually the case, right? So, we still need to consider things like data privacy. So GDPR, HIPAA, the device being validated and the software being validated into the software component. And of course, you also need to keep comprehensive audit trails. Obviously, that's crucial for alignment with, FDA and MDR requirements. So you also need to have, electronic systems and performance monitoring. So What you can do is things like consider implementing security features such as encrypted backups. You can use things like two-factor authentication, role-based access. Most importantly, you need to have audit login, because then you're ensuring that the tools used are regulatory compliant, and there are clinical trial monitoring tools already out there that are fully compliant and are being used in earnest on studies today. And then, we can do other things as well, additional steps like, labeled consenting and e-signature capabilities. So a number of kind of different things that can help in the process.
That's good. Carl, there's one here, Carl, for what role do patient advocacy groups and KOLs play in clinical trial success? So, I mean, this for me is quite key, actually, because they play a critical role. The key opinion leaders and advocacy groups, they can support not only with recruitment, but also obviously your clinical investigation plan design and your endpoint justifications. So leveraging any key opinion leader that you have access to as a manufacturer is always a good idea, in addition to advocacy groups, because you're thinking of patient centricity along the way as well, which is what regulators are also looking for: end user, usability, etc. of your devices. So, the answer to that in short is they play a critical role. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And actually, I've seen that on the data side as well with patient advocacy groups. They're the people who are using the data collection devices, right? And so working with them to understand how that feels, how that looks, how that is also important, and can be absolutely valuable, particularly when it comes to getting things like, additional patient on board, so recruitment, and really getting people to adopt those studies. Okay, there's a question here about using. The question is, how can we use AI to plan out and outline a strategy? And have we actually used this tool? And the person finds AI a good use for streamlining the process. So I think, back to my earlier point, whilst you can use AI tools to make life easier, I think what you need to be aware of is what you get out is only as good as the prompts that you put in. And so, the more information that you can put in the design prompts, the better the outcome that you will get. So yes, it can streamline the process, certainly, but you need to be aware of all the prompts that you're putting in there. So actually taking into account those conversations that you might have with, somebody like OneMed, somebody like ourselves, Greenlight Guru, and the regulatory authorities as well. So utilizing all those together to then put prompts in can help, but I wouldn't use AI as the be-all and the end-all for planning a study. If you want to add anything to that, John.
No, nothing from my end, Carl. That's good.
Okay. I think that's about it.
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm just going to check if there's any more questions. No, I don't think there is, right, Carl? I'm not seeing.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay, so for now, what I'd like to do is thank everybody for sharing your questions. And I think we've answered most of them, but I'm sure there are some that we've not reached. So I appreciate we can't answer everybody's questions here today. So we'll endeavor to respond timely to all questions separately after the webinar. We can be reached directly via the QR code presented on our slides at any point, so please do so. I hope that you've had a lot from today's webinar, and I would just like to take a moment to thank everybody. Cal, I'm sure you would as well.
Yep, I'd just like to say thanks a lot for joining us today. Obviously, we've covered a lot around regulatory shifts and study planning considerations, smarter data capture, and what it really takes to run efficient, compliant MedTech trials.
Yeah, indeed. And the landscape is evolving fast, of course, but with the right strategies and tools, you'll be in a strong position to move faster, reduce risk, and bring in devices to market with confidence.
Yeah, and I think, as you can see, both myself and John's details can be found by scanning the QR codes on screen. So please connect with us and reach out if you want to dive deeper into anything we've covered. Ping us with any questions. And thanks again for your time. It's really, really appreciated. Indeed.
Carl, there's just a comment in the chat that I see. Will we be sharing our slides? And the answer to that is yes.
Yeah,
right, Carl?
Yeah, absolutely. A full recording and slides will all be sent out afterwards. Expect to see the email in a couple of days.
Very good. Okay. Yep. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Carl.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, John. Bye.
Bye.